Alright guys, welcome back. So for those of you who don't follow the updates on my Patreon account, you may not be aware that last week I was at the Animex Festival at Teesside University, where I gave a workshop on Game Maker Studio. It was totally awesome. I'll be writing a blog post or something about that very soon. But importantly, that's why there was no new tutorial video last week. What there was last week, however, is I managed to get a new article written for GameMakerTutorials.com on the very basics of Game Maker Studio, and also from this point onwards I'll be striving to do a new article tutorial alongside a video tutorial every week from this point onwards, so hopefully look forward to a lot more written content if that's more your sort of thing, alongside the regular weekly video content that I do here. So with that out of the way, this week's tutorial is going to be on expanding the inventory tutorial that I did a little while ago, just in a minor way. So previously I set it up so we have, you might remember these boxes here. I've added it so it's like the max is a bit bigger, and we can like add items to the inventory just by using a couple of scripts, and we can remove items from the inventory using those scripts. And I showed you how to generally interact with this and like how we're storing items and so on and so forth to give you the freedom to build whatever system you had in mind for your inventory. Just to give kind of an example of how you might expand this system and create a system of like manipulating or interfacing with this inventory. Words are hard. I'm going to set it up so that you can use the mouse to like highlight an item, click on an item, and drag it to like a different slot, or something like that. Okay? So that's what we're going to be doing today. So to start us off, the code is mostly the same as it was at the end of the previous inventory tutorial. It should be mostly exactly the same, other than I changed it so instead of P adding like our debug button P, which just adds an item to our inventory, instead of adding the same item, it adds one at random, just so that we can have like a nice mix of items. Although I managed to add 8 blue potions in a row, that's pretty, well, the odds of that are, but that's pretty cool. So yeah, that's really the only major change, and increase the max number of items in the inventory. It's been kind of a while since I touched this, and I changed a few things when I was like preparing stuff for this tutorial, so there may be a few tiny specific changes in the code here or there that I've forgotten about, but it all mostly works in the same way. So hopefully if you're following along step by step, the main thing is obviously, of course, pay attention to the logic that I'm using and make sure you understand it, and of course the code will be available for download in the description of the video. So as you might remember, previously we had these scripts that are useful for interfacing with our inventory. One to check to see if we have a specific item, a script to remove an item from the inventory, and a script to add an item to the inventory. The two scripts that we have, script item drop and script item pickup, which add and remove items from the inventory, they look for the first instance of a specific item and then remove it from the inventory, or the item pickup looks for the first empty slot and adds an item to that slot. Whereas how we want to interface with this inventory is a bit more specific. So we're going to create a couple of new scripts to allow us to use the inventory in a specific slot-based manner, so to add an item to a specific slot or remove an item from a specific slot, which is actually, you know, easier than than the scripts we have set up to just remove the first one, because we don't have to, we're just dealing with a very specific slot. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and say insert script. I'm just going to make this first one, I'm going to make this scr item pickup underscore slot. So it's just the same name as the other one, but with slot on the end, so that we know that we're dealing with a specific slot. So let's start out by just writing what we want the script to actually do in like a comment. So I'm just going to write a comment and write scr underscore item pickup underscore slot, and we want to pick the specific slot that we're checking and what item we're going to add to it. So there's the item we're going to add to it and the slot. Those are the two things we're going to pass along to this script. So argument 0 is going to be the specific item that we're going to put in that slot, and argument 1 is going to be the slot that we're going to put the item into. So, and if you remember how our previous inventory system works, if you don't, go back and watch that tutorial again, you might, so you can understand what variables I'm using here, because I'm just following on from the previous code, is if global.inventory argument 1, so the name of the slot that we're using, and we're checking the array where we store all our inventory items, equals -1. So if that slot that we've given the command is empty at the moment, because we don't want to add, we're basically just going to have this command fail if the slot that we're trying to add the item to is full, and then like you can return an error or whatever. We're going to return a 1 if it works, and return a 0 if it doesn't, and then you can do whatever you want to with those results. Okay. So we're checking to see if that slot is currently empty. If it is empty, then we can just go ahead and add the item argument 0 to that slot. So we can just have to say global.inventory argument 1 equals argument 0. And then there it is, we've added that item to that slot. And therefore it's worked, so we can say return 1. And if we didn't get to there, that means it didn't work, because it means the slot wasn't empty, so we can just say return 0. And then you can use those use that 1 or 0 with the variable. Like, if you use a variable to check the result of this script, then you can see whether or not you've successfully added the item, or you failed to add the item because it was full, and then you could show a message to the player or do whatever you want to in that circumstance. Here we're just going to kind of ignore it if we're not able to add the item to the slot. So that's adding an item to a specific slot. Now we want one more script, so I'm going to create another script, scr_item drop slot. So again, just the same as item drop, but instead of dropping the first instance of a specific item, we're just going to drop an item from a specific slot. So we're going to say if, first of all, check that slot that we're going to, well, I should say what the command is going to be. It's going to be scr_item drop _slot, and then the only argument we need for this one is the slot that we're going to empty. So I'm just going to say if global.inventory argument 0, which is the slot, does not equal -1, which means that there's something in it, right? So if there's something in the slot that we're trying to empty, then empty the slot. Global.inventory argument 0 equals -1. Return 1. I mean, I don't know under what circumstances you want to say, like, oh, we didn't manage to empty the slot, it was already empty. But in case you want that information, we can still return the numbers as appropriate and do the check. And that's that. So those are the two scripts that we need for setting this up. And now what we're going to do next is we're going to create two items, two new objects even. We're going to create an object called obj_inv_button, and we're going to create basically a button for every one of those little squares that you saw on the screen. We're not going to make a new object for each one. We're going to make one object, and that object is going to clone itself over all of the spaces, and it's going to detect whether or not it's clicked on, and if it is, it'll interact with the inventory in some way. It'll be an invisible button. So we're going to create invisible buttons for every item of the inventory, and then we're going to create an object that follows the mouse around that will show what item we're currently carrying in the mouse. So we can click on one of these invisible buttons to move an item from a particular item slot into our mouse object, and then that mouse object can put that item into another slot. Now before we make those two new objects, I'm going to set it up in the main inventory object to actually create them dynamically. We obviously need to establish them later. In fact, let's establish what they are first. So I'm going to go into objects and hit create object, say obj_inv_button. Those are going to be our invisible buttons that we keep under the boxes of the inventory, and we'll make them highlight when you're hovering over them, but otherwise they're just going to sit there and just be invisible buttons that you can click on with the mouse and allow us to move items from one slot to another. No sprite needed, and the depth is just going to be -1000 and 1001, just so it's deeper than just so that it can actually show up when we want to do the highlight. We can show up in front of the other stuff. Okay, so that's that one. And we need to make another object, which is obj_mouse item, and that's going to be the object that follows our mouse around, and is going to show when we're carrying an item in our mouse. we'll set that we want that one to show up above everything else, so I'm going to set that one to be minus 1002, so that's one's at the lowest depth. Okay, so that's those two. They don't do anything yet, so let's go into the inventory object and actually set it up so they can get made, because we don't need to place them in the room, we're going to make them dynamically from the inventory object itself. So in here, when we're setting up our inventory for the first time, and we're setting up this based on the number of item slots we have, I'm also going to go ahead and create inventory buttons for every slot. So I'm going to say button I, which is the slot that we're working on at the moment when we're setting up the inventory in the first place, equals instance create 0 0 obj underscore inv button. The reason I'm doing this and setting them up as an array is so that I can refer to all of the buttons later on when I want to draw the inventory, so I could move them all about one by one based on which slot the button represents. And then take that button again and set one of its variables. I'm going to set slot to equal I. So that the button itself, the instance that we've just created, knows which slot of the inventory it represents, because it now has a variable to track that. That's what we need to do for that one. And then for the mouse object, we need to first of all establish a new global variable. So I'm going to say global var mouse item, and that variable is just going to track whatever item is being carried around by the mouse at any given time. So it can be -1 for nothing, can be 0 for I think the sword, 1 for the potion, and so on and so forth. Obviously, to begin with, it's going to be nothing, so I'm going to say mouse item to equal -1. And then we just need to create a single one of this object that's just going to follow the mouse around. So I'm going to say instance create 0 0, doesn't really matter, obj underscore mouse item, like that. And then the only other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the draw event, and down here where we're working out where to draw our sprites and draw our inventory items, is we can actually get rid of this line that actually draws each item, because we're going to use the buttons themselves to draw the specific item on each slot, so we don't need this anymore. Button I dot x equals ix, button I dot y equals iy, so that we're taking the button for each specific slot, the slot being I, taking its x and y coordinates and setting them to the same x and y coordinates as we're drawing the borders around the UI. So I'm going to place these buttons in the same spot that we're placing the borders, and those buttons are going to be responsible for drawing the items themselves into those borders, which is why we needed the depth to be further forward than the inventory. Okay, so now those are all the changes we actually needed to make to the inventory object. Now, I mean, if we run the game now, those invisible buttons are all there, and in fact the object that's following around the mouse, well, it isn't following the mouse yet, but that object exists and it's in the top left corner of the screen being invisible. If I add P, if I press P, I am still adding items to the inventory via our press P key event, but they're not showing up anymore because I'm not drawing them to the screen anymore. We're going to use the inventory buttons to do that. But the array is still storing those items there. The functionality is still working, but we got rid of the line that draws the thing. So that's everything we need to do in the inventory object. Now I'm going to go into our obj underscore inv button, and I'm going to set the create event first of all. Oh no, I'm not. We don't need the create event for this one. I'm going to add the draw event even. And I think the draw event is all we actually need for this object. The draw event actually, because the draw event happens every frame, you can kind of use it to do similar things that you do with the step event, because it kind of works in the same way in that it's an event that's triggered every single frame. But you can also do drawing stuff. It just happens at a slightly different time in that frame than the step event does. Namely, towards the very end when everything is rendered. So in the draw event for our inventory button, I'm going to say var item equals global dot inventory slot. So we know the slot variable was a variable that was passed to this item when it got created, so that it knows what slot the button represents. and I'm going to get the item that is currently in that slot and store it in a temporary variable. The next one variable we need is click. Var click equals mouse underscore check underscore button underscore pressed NB left. So click is just going to tell us whether or not the left mouse button's been pressed yet. So I'm going to check to see whether or not we've just clicked on this square, really. Or rather, I'm going to check to see if we're hovering the mouse over the square, and if we're hovering the mouse over the square, I can highlight it white by drawing like a white rectangle over the top of where the little border sprite would currently be. And then, if we're hovering over it, then we can check if we're clicking as well, and if we're clicking as well, we can start to do stuff with the actual inventory slot. So I'm going to say draw, no, I'm going to say, sorry, skipping ahead, if abs mouse underscore x minus x is less than 16, and abs mouse underscore y minus y less than 16. So again, I'm just checking the difference. Checking the difference here between the mouse coordinate, the x coordinate of the mouse, and the x coordinate of this very button. The difference between those, and if by checking the absolute, so it, even if it's like a negative, it returns a positive. By checking the difference between these two variables and seeing if it's less than 16 means that we're 16 pixels within 16 pixels of the absolute x coordinate of this object. And the same goes for this. So if we're within 16 pixels vertically and within 16 pixels horizontally. Just using abs and checking the difference between two variables and seeing if it's less than a certain figure, it's a very simple way of checking whether or not you're within X number of pixels of something. So this will tell us whether or not the mouse is currently hovering over the inventory button. If it is, I'm going to go ahead and say draw set color to be C underscore white, and I'm going to just draw a rectangle over the top of it. So rectangle, we need 4 coordinates for this, so x minus 16, because this is a 32 by 32 block we're going to draw, so I'm going to draw it like 16 from the center in each direction. Y minus 16, x plus 16, y plus 16, and it's not an outline, so 0. So yeah, and that should work by and large out of itself, so let's see if that works first of all. Yep, so now if we hover over each one of these slots, you can see it's drawing like a little white rectangle, so we can highlight each slot of the inventory now. It's pretty cool. So, we're going to say if under brackets click. So if we're actually clicking on the inventory now, first of all we're going to check to see whether or not there was an item in the slot after we clicked on it. So I'm going to say if item does not equal -1. So if there was an item here, in which case remove it, scr underscore item drop underscore slot. Luckily, the variable item, this temporary variable, isn't going to update right away. It's only going to update at the start of this event. So we still have stored in this variable the item that we just got rid of, so we don't need to worry about the fact that we've just emptied this slot. So that means we can say if mouse item does not equal -1, so if we have an item on our mouse, which I know we haven't set up yet, but we'll get to that, scr underscore item pickup slot mouse item slot, so we can add our current mouse item to the slot, and again that adds it to the slot, which is changing global.inventory, but that hasn't changed this variable yet. And because we still have that variable, we can now just say mouse item equals item, and of course if item is -1, then it's going to set it to be blank, and if there was an item in the slot, then it puts that item in our hand, so it would swap the items around if there was one, and would just give us no item left if there wasn't one in there in the first place, so it all kind of works out. That's everything we need to do there in terms of actually interacting with the inventory. Now we just need to get the items themselves to actually show up on the button. So I'm going to say if item is not equal -1, draw underscore sprite spr underscore items item x y. Really simple. We're just going to draw that sprite if we need to. From spr underscore items, that's a sprite that stores all our items in it. Item gives us the frame, the appropriate frame of the item that we need to draw, and x, y is just our coordinates. So really simple as that. So that should work in terms of interacting with the inventory. And we can test that now by running it. And you should see that, okay, so if we add some items to the inventory by pressing P, if I click on the blue potion here, it disappears. And if I click over here, it reappears. So we can move one item from one slot to another now. If I click on that sword and I click on this potion, it replaces the potion with the sword, and now I have the potion in my hand, and I can place the potion into another slot. The only problem now is, of course, we don't know what is in our mouse at any point in time, because we haven't set the mouse item object up to follow our mouse around and show us what item is being moved from what spot to another, right? So that's all that we have left to do, but the system fundamentally works and our interaction is there. So now I'm just going to go into mouse item, obj underscore mouse item, and for this one I'm just going to again just add the draw event. I think that's pretty much the only one we need for this. Drag in, execute piece of code, and I'm going to say var item equals mouse item, so we know. A temporary variable to just tell us what item we're using every frame, so we're not constantly looking up this global variable. If item does not equal -1, x equals mouse x, because we don't need to bother doing all this stuff if we're not actually carrying an item. Y equals mouse y, and draw sprite spr underscore items item x y. Simple as that. Okay, and we can run that now. You should see that if I add a bunch of items, click one, it now follows the mouse around. This mouse item is being set appropriately, and if mouse item has value in it, then mouse item is going to follow the mouse around and draw the sprite in the correct place. And we can see we can move items around the inventory now. No problem at all. Overlap one another. Swap items with one another. Super simple. Okay, so there's just really just a kind of a really quick fire tutorial on how to set up, just because there's any number of different things you could do with this inventory system, with this like sort of way of just storing items in an array like this, and just finding new interesting ways to display and move them around and interface with them. And this is just one example of how you might start to do that. Yeah, so I hope that was useful to you guys. As I said, more article-based content coming soon, along with new videos, and I'll catch you guys next week. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you then.